So now that we have examined the erythrocytes, let's take a moment to investigate the leukocytes. The leukocytes are far less abundant than the erythrocytes. Typically we see about 10,000 leukocytes per microliter of blood. Recall that we saw roughly 5 million erythrocytes in the same volume of blood, so these are far less abundant. The leukocytes function primarily in the various immune responses of the body. We'll see that they destroy bacteria, viruses, parasites, and even tumor or cancer cells. So all of the leukocytes are formed from the hematopoietic stem cells. The hematopoietic stem cells are the same cells that the erythrocytes originate from. We will also see that the platelets come from these hematopoietic stem cells as well. So while there are many intermediates on this diagram that we don't cover, we can see that eventually they will all form the different types of leukocytes. So that is the eosinophils, the basophils, the neutrophils, the monocytes, and then the various types of lymphocytes. The leukocytes have the ability to perform what is called diapedesis. So that is, they can crawl out of the bloodstream in order to reach infected tissues. They can sense or they know where to leave the bloodstream because they can detect certain chemical messenger molecules that are released by damaged cells by diseased cells. The leukocytes move by a type of motion called amoeboid motion. So that is, the cell can actually extend little arms of their plasma membranes to help pull them along. So it's necessary for leukocytes to perform diapedesis because, of course, the leukocytes are located within the bloodstream, but we see that many infections occur within the tissues that are external to those blood vessels. So it's important that the leukocytes have the ability to exit the bloodstream so that they can properly fight infections in those tissues. So we see that there are two categories of leukocytes. We have the granulocytes, and we also have the agranulocytes. The granulocytes are named because they have small granules within their cytoplasm, and often the nucleus of the granulocytes will appear to have a couple of different lobes associated with it. With the agranulocytes, we see that there are no visible granules in the cytoplasm, and the nucleus is often large and rounded instead of being lobed. So let's start with the functions of the granulocytes, which are the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. First, the neutrophils are the granulocytes that have a nucleus that contains anywhere between 3 and 6 lobes. The cytoplasm contains pale red or pale blue cytoplasmic granules within it. The neutrophils function as rapid responders to infections, particularly bacterial infections. They make use of enzymes that metabolize oxygen, and in metabolizing oxygen, they create hydrogen peroxide from it. And hydrogen peroxide is extremely toxic, and it's used by the neutrophils to kill the bacteria that they're attacking. We will often see an increase in the number of neutrophils during inflammation or also during acute bacterial infections, such as things like appendicitis or meningitis. Substances that are released by bacteria or released by damaged tissues will cause signal molecules to appear on the plasma membranes of the cells that are lining the blood vessel walls. These signal molecules, which are usually proteins, will get the attention of nearby neutrophils, which can then undergo diapedesis. They will exit the bloodstream, and those leukocytes can then enter the affected tissues. So the neutrophil will then proceed to attack and kill the bacteria or infection that's found in that particular tissue. So next we have the eosinophils, and these are granulocytes that typically have a bilobed, so it's a 2-lobed nucleus, as well as very bright red cytoplasmic granules. These cells are typically found in the mucosa of the respiratory system as well as in the intestines. So the mucosa is the tissue that lines the inner walls of these organs. Some of the eosinophils will function in allergic responses, and some of them function to kill parasitic flatworms or roundworms. These types of worms will usually enter the body through the skin, through the respiratory system, so that is the worm eggs or the worm larvae have been inhaled, or they can also enter through the digestive system where they have been consumed with food. The cytoplasmic granules of the eosinophils contain either antihistamines, so that is, it will contain antihistamines if that eosinophil is involved with allergic responses, or they may contain digestive enzymes if that particular eosinophil is involved in fighting off parasitic worm infections. So last but not least, we have the final of our granulocytes, which are the basophils. And the basophils are cells that contain very dark staining purple granules in their cytoplasm. Often these granules will stain so dark that it is difficult to actually see the nucleus within the cell. The function of the basophil is to add to and enhance the inflammation response. The granules inside of the basophils contain one of two substances. They will contain either histamine or heparin. Now, histamine is a compound that causes blood vessels to dilate, in addition to making the walls of those blood vessels more permeable to other leukocytes, so that those leukocytes can perform diapedesis and enter the affected tissues. The granules will also contain, or could also contain, a substance that's called heparin, which, when released into the bloodstream, will function as an anticoagulant. This is going to help keep the blood flowing and prevent clots from forming during these inflammation responses. We will turn our attention next to the monocytes, which is the first of our two agranular leukocytes. So that these are the agranulocytes. Their cytoplasm does not contain dark staining granules like we saw with the granulocytes. The functions of the monocytes is that they will tend to exit the bloodstream using diapedesis, as we've seen before, and once they leave the bloodstream, they will develop into a cell called a macrophage. And macrophages use a process that's called phagocytosis in order to engulf bacteria, viruses, or they will also engulf dead or damaged cells. And then they will use enzymes to destroy what they have engulfed. So typically monocyte numbers will be elevated during viral infections, during fungal infections, or during chronic, so that is long-term bacterial infections like tuberculosis. Lymphocytes are the second and last of our agranular leukocytes. So they are primarily associated with the lymphatic tissues, which is where their name comes from. They tend to mature within the lymphatic tissues. The lymphocytes are essential for the immune response, and we see that there are three types of lymphocytes: the NK cells, the B lymphocytes, and the T lymphocytes. The NK cells, or the NK lymphocytes, will typically seek out and destroy cancer cells or virus-infected cells. B lymphocytes will function to produce structures called antibodies, and antibodies are small proteins that are released into the bloodstream which will tag foreign or abnormal cells, and those tagged cells can then be identified by the immune system and destroyed. The T lymphocytes, on the other hand, will be the cells that actually target and kill the foreign or diseased cells. Both B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes can survive for many years after a particular infection, which is going to help quickly rally the immune system against a particular pathogen. Vaccines are tools that healthcare workers will use in order to get the body to produce B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes that are going to fight against certain infections. When the immune system has created lymphocytes against a certain bacteria or a certain virus, often that bacteria or virus will be killed so quickly that we may never actually show symptoms of that particular infection. So the phrase, "never let monkeys eat bananas," will help you to recall the abundance of the various leukocytes. Neutrophils are the most common leukocyte, accounting for about 60% of all leukocytes. Next are the lymphocytes, which account for about 30%. Monocytes account for roughly 6%. Eosinophils account for roughly 3%. And finally, the basophils are generally the least common of the leukocytes, accounting for about 1% of the total leukocytes. Of course, the abundance of each leukocyte is going to change because certain leukocytes will increase their numbers during specific types of infections.